It was a couple of years ago that I was wrestling with the delivery of a manuscript that I did not want to deliver. I was in Los Angeles, California, and I had finished a project that I had been working on for several years since I had retired from the military. In fact, I started working on this project while I was in the military. And it was a book about the village stability program that we did in the rough places in Afghanistan to help Afghan villagers stand up on their own. And the reason I wrote that book was because I wanted to share our experiences, good and bad, what we learned with the next generation of warfighters so that we didn't have to do what we did when we started the program by going back to a lot of the experts from the Vietnam era who had not written a lot of this down. And so I wanted to be able to have that continuity and share this thing. And it was such a daunting project. Over 5,000 interviews with village elders, special operators, diplomats, communications experts, you name it. But it was done. And get this, one of the greatest authors on the planet, one of the greatest living authors on the planet, my opinion, but one that's shared by many, Steven Pressfield, had agreed to review the manuscript. Can you believe that? I mean, how many chances do you get to have Steven Pressfield, the author of War of Art, Turning Pro, right? All of these amazing books that wrote the book The Legend of Bagger Vance. I mean, this guy's a legend. And here he is. He's agreed to review my manuscript because we had a common interest in the tribes of Afghanistan and stabilizing that place, and he loved our approach. The problem was I was going to have to give him my manuscript. It was on that morning that I was leaving my hotel to meet Steve for breakfast, and then I had the manuscript in my hand that everything just changed. And I decided I just couldn't do it. It wasn't ready. It wasn't worth his time yet. I needed to do some more work. And besides, who the hell was I to be given a manuscript to Steve Pressfield? I'd never written a book before. I'd certainly never written anything like this before. What were my peers going to think? What were the guys who were still fighting over there going to think? Who am I to be writing this kind of book? Who am I to be handing a book to a New York Times best-selling author to review my novice crap? That's what I was literally saying to myself out loud as I was walking around the hotel frantically, trying to talk myself into going. Doing that, I managed to trip. And when I tripped, this manuscript that I had in my hand that was held together by a single butterfly clip went into the air, and I watched it explode in midair, and paper after paper floated down by the hundreds all around me. I looked at the floor, and I just started laughing. And I knew that was a sign that I had no business turning this manuscript in yet. I had to be with Steve in less than 20 minutes, and these papers were everywhere. So that was it. I made the decision that it was just not the time, and frankly, we'd find some other time to do this. About that time, I decided to give my dad a call because I knew that there was something bothering me about this, and normally that's the guy who I talk to. So I gave my dad a call, and I let him know what had happened. This was not the time. The manuscript wasn't ready. And I even said, Dad, who the hell am I to be writing a book like this anyway, and taking Steve Pressfield's time. And he said to me in his infinite dad wisdom, like he always does, who the hell are you not to do that? What happens if you don't write this book? What happens if you don't put this out there? What will those future special operators, including your son, have to go off of based on the lessons you learned? Who are you not to do this? Because that's the question you should be asking. As soon as he said that, I was like, damn it. He was right. So I hung up, got down, and started picking up the papers, put them all together, and took them to meet Steve at breakfast. And I handed him just, this stack of crap that was all over the place. And, Steve's such a great guy. He was like, oh, you know what? This is exactly how I like it because now I can just read them laying down like this. This is how I like to read papers. Manuscripts. But I handed it off to him. And He returned it back to me with some of the kindest words and biggest levels of support that I've ever had from someone of his caliber. And probably the thing that means the most to me is that he wrote the foreword of Game Changers. He wrote the foreword of this book. That's how much he believed in what was in here and the lessons that were so hard fought by so many of our operators in these rough places. And, you know, that's made a real difference in Game Changers going local to defeat violent extremists. And a lot of times this book getting in front of very senior people, when they see the foreword by Stephen Pressfield, they're like, okay, I'm going to give this a read. This content stands on its own. I would stand by this book any day, but the fact that Steve not only read it for me, but he wrote the foreword. And the point that I want to try to make on all this is that, you know, it's real easy for us to feel like we are not the person. It's real easy for us to feel like, you know, that we are not the right individual to do the big task. You know, this month in our year of the scar, if 2020 is the year of the scar, and repurposing our struggles, this month's pain point that we're talking about is self-sabotage. And one of the biggest elements of self-sabotage is an imposter syndrome. You know, Steve Pressfield, in his book, The War of Art, he talks about this thing called resistance, and that is self-sabotage and all the different ways it can show up. And for business leaders, for rooftop leaders, for community leaders, one of the biggest ways that this can show up is imposter syndrome. You think, who the hell am I to do this? Just like I was in that hotel room that morning. Wes and I were talking off camera. Wes has been making music for years, man. Dude's played Radio City Music Hall. And you know what he's thinking about when he's getting ready to take that stage? Shall I tell him, Wes?
Yeah, go for it.
Who the hell am I to be up here? Right? All those years, all decades of making music, and that's still on his mind. Frank Sinatra was throwing up in the toilet before his last performance. That's okay. Right? This is part of leading with scars. This is what authentic, relatable leaders do. We're going to question ourselves. We're going to ask ourselves, who am I to be standing in front of the boss asking for this resource? Who am I to be standing in front of this prospect trying to make them a client with my background? Who am I to propose this nonprofit when I don't know anything about this, right? Who am I to go in there and do this presentation when I'm the most junior associate? I will tell you, you're exactly who they need. And rather than asking yourself, who am I to do this? Ask yourself, who am I not to do this? Right? Because you are depriving us of the stuff that you've got. You are depriving us of the gifts that you were given. Right? We need that. The world is hungry for authentic, relatable leaders who lead with their scars. And you never know how this will turn out. A #1 international bestseller that is now required reading at the qualification course for Green Berets, Special Operations, the Infantry Schoolhouse, right? It has been read by thousands of special operators deploying all over the world. It's even been used in law enforcement in Philadelphia and California for community policing. But what if I had listened to my imposter syndrome? What if I had let that voice win out? We can't. We have to lean into what scares us, and we have to be willing to do what others won't. So here's some steps for you. One is when you're going in front of other people, whether you're presenting something, selling something, pitching something, make sure you know the other party. Make sure you know what their pain is. What are their pain points, right? And be willing to share your scars in relation to their pain. Talk about what you learned, how it changed you, what you evolved into as a result of that. Be authentic and relatable when you do it, and that universal singular will connect you at an emotional level. Steve understood, you know, where I was coming from. I understood his pain points. He understood mine, and he understood the value of what this book could bring to the world. But had I listened to my own voices and my own self-sabotage, that wouldn't have happened. Right? So be willing to do those things. One other piece of advice I'll give you, rooftop leaders, is if you haven't read War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, you absolutely need to read it. It is an amazing read. It breaks down this thing called resistance or self-sabotage in so many ways. It helps you look at ways to overcome it. A lot of what we've talked about here, but even more. So check that out. Also, if you haven't checked out my TED Talk, The Generosity of Scars, please give that a look. It's a message that we need to hear. 2020 is the year of the scar. Share that with someone in your life who needs to see it, and share your scars, right? And be willing to overcome this thing we call imposter syndrome. When you feel yourself saying, who am I to do this? Take my dad's advice. Who am I not to do this? And then give us the best stuff you've got. Thanks for what you do. I'll see you on the rooftop.